Every week, Hillsdale College President Larry Arnn joins Hugh Hewitt to discuss great books, great men, and great ideas. This is Hillsdale Dialogues, part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. More episodes at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you find your audio.
Morning, glory, America. Bonjour, hi, Canada. I'm Hugh Hewitt, and we've moved to a new time, but the Hillsdale Dialogue has moved along with us. It's the last hour of the week of the Hugh Hewitt Show and has been for a decade. And if you're new to the program, because we moved to afternoon drive in the east and noon to 3 in the west, I want you to know that you can find all prior Hillsdale Dialogues at hillsdale.edu. We are in the Republic of Plato, translation by Alan Bloom. And this is the hour in which we go high. And we're in book 8 and 9 this hour, which means it's the penultimate walkthrough. And we spent probably a dozen weeks on the Republic of Plato, and I encourage you to go back. All things Hillsdale are collected at hillsdale.edu, all the dialogues at hughforhillsdale.com. My guests today are the president of Hillsdale College, Dr. Larry Arnn, and Dr. Daniel O'Toole, professor of philosophy, political theory at Hillsdale, where he teaches the Republic often. So I'm going to begin with you, Dr. O'Toole, as we begin to land the plane, and we'll land it next week. We're in books 8 and 9, which I kind of read together, and I wanted to put them together if it's at all possible. It opens this way. For a city that is going to be governed on a high level, women must be in common, children and their entire education must be in common, and finally the practices in war and peace must be in common, and their kings must be those among them who prove best in philosophy in respect to war. All right. That sounds so radical. That sounds like Marx. Does he really believe it, or is he setting us up?
Well, it is radical. He is setting us up some. It sounds a little bit like Marx. One crucial difference, and I don't know if we've stressed this enough in our discussion, is that what Socrates really is proposing is a kind of communism of women and children, that is, sharing of the family members. You don't actually have your own private children that you raise or your own private wife that you live with among the ruling class. So it's not among the entire city. It's among the ruling class. And what Socrates is thinking through is what would be required, what would be necessary in order to have a ruling class that is wholly devoted to the common good and that is as rational as possible, that would ultimately support and sustain philosophic rule. And his suggestion is you need a unique kind of ruling class, a ruling class where men are not attached to their own private lives and looking out for the well-being of their own family, which is a massive source of factionalism, especially among elites in cities, and a ruling class that, I think when one gets into it, that is not as religious as normal ruling classes are, at least in traditional cities, and hence is more willing to subordinate themselves to philosophers. And a major source of religion, of course, is the family, or there's a deep connection. The gods always help sustain and support the family. So among the ruling elite, he's thinking through, how do we uproot those things that keep men attached to their own private lives, their own families too much, or thinking too much about the other world and not what's reasonable and rational here and now. And this is what would be required. It's very radical.
It's so radical that, Dr. Arnn, do you think he's serious?
Well, he's serious about us learning, right? You know, in this book 8 that we're talking about, he describes kinds of regimes, and each kind reflects some basic need and impulse in the human being. We all have them. In some of us, one dominates with another. And one of the needs is to know. And that's the noblest of the needs and the most reliable. And so the question is, can that rule? Can that be the way it goes? You know, in America, we don't have the rule of philosophers. We have consent of the governed, all of us, right? Why is that defensible against the claim that the one who knows should rule? In fact, bureaucratic government has a kind of truncated view of that one who knows should rule. Experts should rule. Those are people who are technicians and scientists, right? And the point is, let's just imagine defining knowledge as knowledge of the highest thing, and the philosophic soul as wholly devoted to that, what would it take to set that up and institutionalize that and live according to that? So this is the greatest thought experiment about that thing that has a real claim on our affection.
It is a thought experiment. It is also the first effort, Aristotle will expand on it in the Politics, to kind of categorize the city-states. And we have the philosopher kings, democracy, oligarchy, democracy, and tyranny. First, Professor O'Toole, why does he spend all of Book 9 on one? I mean, he covers all of them in Book 8, but Book 9 is only about tyranny. Is that a warning to us that that's most likely what we're going to end up with?
Possibly. I mean, I think the major thing is that the tyrannical soul becomes a picture of the soul that unleashes its own passions and doesn't have rational control within the own soul. And so it's a kind of picture of what is ultimately the most unjust life that you can then compare with the most just life, which is the rule of philosophy, rule of the rational part of the soul.
So the most unjust life gets attention in order to contrast it with the just life. Dr. Arnn, do we have tyrants today in any way, shape, or form familiar because of the Republic? I think we do, but I want to know what you think.
Well, I just said it. The claim of in modern political science, there's a school of thought around the rational state, right? That's reason ruling. It's not this reason. It's not Plato's reason, by the way. And this is light years from Marx, right? Because Marx is actually closer to the bureaucratic state. But the claim is that science, which doesn't mean knowing anymore, it means making and dissecting and manipulating. Science can do wonders, and it should govern everything. And we should have a rational procedure, that is, rules and we talked about that, about the LA fires, right? They're enmeshed in rules of their own making, and they can't put out a fire. And they can't use a big old reservoir that's sitting empty, pictures of it all over the world now. And so we have an attempt at that on a very different ground, because Plato's, the base claims of progressivism don't make sense, right? In other words, all you got to do is read John Dewey and then ask yourself the question, do you want him to decide everything in your life? Whereas if you read Plato, it's ennobling, and he is pointing you to something that's higher in the human being than other things. And so it's a better thing than that.
He's pointing us to Churchill and Lincoln, who were self-denying absolutists for a period of time. They have near absolute power, and Washington, and they lay it down. But I meant today abroad in Putin, Xi, Khamenei. We've got tyrants of the sort that he's talking about. So he was way ahead of his time.
Well, if I could say one thing, I think the Dr. Arnn is saying, I think is really helpful. You could say Plato thinks through everything that human beings long for in this world and tries to show you what would be required to deliver it. And you could say progressivism itself has that same fundamental ambition. If you read the progressives, I find it quite striking how much they sought to realize in this world, much, not all, but much of what Plato characterizes in the Republic. They want a perfect community. They want a community where the most reasonable men rule. Now, it's true, I think they have a truncated view of what reason knows, but they want a community where men are wholly devoted to it, where they're virtuous, where they get everything that they truly deserve, not just economically, but the opportunities they deserve, and then the opportunity to then in turn serve. And that's all of those elements are what the Republic at least attempts to realize, though as we're seeing, that becomes impossible because of the ways in which the attempt to realize that do violence to our own nature. For instance, in fighting against our attachment to the private family. Yeah.
Pause right there. I do want to pause the Hillsdale Dialogue to remind everyone that the Hillsdale Dialogues are brought to you by Hillsdale College. Everything Hillsdale is at hillsdale.edu. All things Hillsdale, including the application, are there. You can also become a regular recipient of the monthly speech digest Imprimis, absolutely free, delivered by snail mail. Also, all the previous Hillsdale Dialogues, all of them, hundreds of them, are found at Hugh4Hillsdale.com. Hugh4Hillsdale.com. Coming right back with Professor O'Toole, Dr. Larry Arnn, President of Hillsdale College, right after this. Stay tuned.
It's no secret that Americans are more divided than ever. And it's not just over what policies will improve our great country. No, it's over whether America is great at all, whether America deserves our love. That's why Imprimis is so important. Imprimis looks at the issues of the day from a constitutional perspective, reminding citizens always of our great heritage of liberty. For more than 50 years, Imprimis has featured speeches from the smartest conservative thinkers and writers at Hillsdale events. These days, Hillsdale publishes people like Molly Hemingway, Andy Puzder, Harmeet Dillon, and Chris Rufo. Over 6.4 million American households and businesses receive Imprimis absolutely free. And I urge you to sign up for it today at no charge. To get your free lifetime subscription, go to hillsdale.edu/lifetime right now. Or text the word Imprimis to 71844 and we'll send you a link to sign up for your free lifetime subscription. That's IMPRIMIS to 71844.
Welcome back, America. The Hillsdale Dialogue underway. Professor Daniel O'Toole, Dr. Larry Arnn. Let me turn back to Professor O'Toole for a moment here. I got to ask you before I miss it, I made a vow to myself that the hardest sentence in the Republic is in Book 8, 546b. And I want you to just tell me what it means, or what is he doing here?
Okay, maybe I should look it up.
For a divine birth, there is a period comprehended by a perfect number. For a human birth, by the first number in which root and square increases, comprising 3 distances and 4 limits of elements that make like and unlike, and that wax and wane, render everything conversible and rational. Of these elements, the root 4-3 mated with the 5 thrice increased produces 2 harmonies. All right, I didn't get it. I tried. What's that mean, both of you?
What's there not to understand, Hugh? Come on. That's the so-called nuptial number, which is a way of calculating the right time to reproduce, supposedly based on the revolution of the spheres and their relationship to various organic beings, including human beings. I think it's all one elaborate joke.
Okay.
But when Socrates gets into the math, people have never been able to figure out what exactly he's saying with the math. Now, the suggestion, the hope there is maybe there's a strict correspondence between nature and what we can rationally know, such that we can manage childbirth. That is reproduction, that is sex and eros, and then, of course, raising children. Now, the idea, the hope there is that if you could perfectly manage reproduction, eugenics, then you can maintain and sustain a perfect ruling class, a ruling class that isn't contaminated men with selfish passions. And that's, of course, not possible. And so what Socrates is in an elaborate way showing you is eventually, even if you could achieve this best regime, it will fall apart because the ruling class will eventually become inferior and be divided against itself, and men will have normal, base, selfish passions, including a passion for wealth and honor, that will eventually divide the rulers against each other.
Dr. Arnn, is it a good way to
Let me illustrate.
Go ahead.
Let me illustrate why this is funny. You once persuaded the fetching Mrs. Hewitt, to your wife,
yes,
me, the beautiful Penelope.
Yes.
We didn't read them things like this when we were talking to them.
No, we did not.
The funny thing about this is, obviously, it doesn't work that way. You know.
Exactly.
Well, it is, but it's right. What do your students do, Daniel, when they run into this? Do they come in despairing of ever understanding the book?
Oh, they're laughing. And they vaguely sense that there's something crazy about all this. Yeah. There's a chorus, by the way, he describes the philosophic city and why it's impossible. And he also describes the philosophic family and why it's impossible. And it turns out there, the father is so aloof, and the wife in particular is a nag, and she gets sick of the fact that he's not seeking wealth and honor within the city. And she's constantly complaining about this to her son. And so the sons eventually don't end up being like the philosophic fathers. So I think this is quite funny, too.
Yeah, but I did like, and I had forgotten it after all these years, the description of timocracy, which is not a word often used. And Dr. Arnn, that seems to me to be a pretty good regime. And we're not going to get philosopher kings. They don't want to do it in any event. But if you get a timocracy, you're in pretty good shape if you can hang on to it. You agree or disagree with that?
Well, it'll break down, too, because you need to know, right? I mean, it's, it certainly does take a certain attitude that rather martial to be a ruler, but that's not enough. And it is very honorable. I watched some snippets of the Hickseth confirmation hearings.
Oh, those are fiery.
That's a very honorable guy.
Yes.
He's a warrior guy. And you need guys like that, right? No. But, that's not enough. One thing you learn from Plato's Republic is philosophy is the best thing. It's not enough. And you said something earlier. You said, one of the ways you can mark out really great statesmen is that they protect learning.
Yeah.
And tyrants hate it, right? That's in Plato. That's in Aristotle's Politics in Book 5. Tyrants don't like high thoughts. Hitler was always persecuting people who were religious or philosophic or scientific. And that's because they don't want anything higher than they. And, Church, in one of Churchill's early beautiful attacks on Hitler, he mentions Jews, scientists, and philosophers come under his assault, you see. And that's, in other words, what the philosophers want when they're great is they want statesmen who are touched with philosophy and respect it. And that's different than being a philosopher, but it too is a very high thing.
Well, the highest thing, after I've gone through all this, is we have spent an inordinate amount of time on the Hillsdale Dialogues over the years, on three men, Washington, Lincoln, and Churchill. And they were all absolutely ambitious to lead, and they would not hold on to power. Lincoln, of course, did not have the opportunity to lay down power, but the other two did and did lay down power. That seems to me to be the fundamental lacking element in every other form of these governments other than they were philosopher kings, Daniel. Do you agree with that, Professor O'Toole? Those three are philosopher kings?
Well, I wouldn't call them philosopher kings, but I would call them liberally educated statesmen. And I think that's a real human possibility that is, in fact, higher than the timocrat that you were asking about. You could say the timocrat is somebody who simply loves honor and is a victory lover. And the fundamental problem, though, with the timocrat and with all of the regimes, and this is what Dr. Arnn was getting at, is there's not a genuine civic education. There's not a true education of the soul that allows them to stave off corruption and decline. Now, the ultimate source of such an education can only be wisdom about the most fundamental things, can only be philosophic. So all of the regimes are going to be defective insofar as they lack that source of the truest education. But I do think that when you look at all the regimes of Book 8, they're, first of all, just extremely relevant to our world, especially the three really bad regimes. We see them everywhere.
Oligarchy, democracy, tyranny.
Yeah, that's yes, right. That's what I meant to say. Yeah, democracy, oligarchy, and tyranny. And democracy is a little bit higher. But what I was going to say was that I think there's a regime that is somewhere higher than democracy, but lower than the unrealistic philosophic regime of the Republic. And there, may be various sorts. Plato experiments with this in another dialogue of his called The Laws, which is a sort of aristocratic republic that is actually realizable in the world. And then, of course, one could think about the regime of the American founders as maybe not quite the same as that, but an approximation of that, which allows for civic education and allows for institutions that check some of the worst defects in the regime.
Pause for a moment. The American founding. There's a great video course on it at hillsdale.edu on what goes into our Constitution. Remember, all things Hillsdale at hillsdale.edu. All of the prior Hillsdale dialogues can be found at hugh4hillsdale.com. Go explore, find something you like, get smart, come back to the Hugh Hewitt Show. Welcome back, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt, Dr. Larry Arnn, Professor Daniel O'Toole, and I are talking about the Republic. You know, we're not supposed to talk about politics and religion, but that's pretty much all we ever talk about on the Hillsdale Dialogues. Dr. Arnn, I hesitate to introduce theology here, and I don't want to upset my Calvinist friends. I'm not a Calvinist, so I go to Presbyterian Church. This does seem to be very heavy on the predestination, that the corruption of regime is inevitable, renewal maybe not so much. Is he talking about the inevitability of tyranny in most regimes?
Well, classical philosophy is very aware of a truth, and that is that every human thing will pass away. You know, we're not gods making immortals. I love that part in the Lord of the Rings movie where the day will come when the West falls, but not today. That's the right attitude. And that's Lincoln and Churchill's attitude.
Yeah, this too shall pass.
So they think that, and he's also, I mean, there's an immense amount of practical wisdom in this book that is profoundly unrealistic in some ways, right? Meant to be, I think. I think almost everything in this book that I can discover is intentional. He's a master. But this thing, that the love of honor is very powerful.
But so is the love of money. If I were one of these billionaire oligarchs of Silicon Valley, I'd be studying the Republic and be very worried about what happens, because eventually they come for you. The tyrants come for the oligarchs.
That's it.
Yes.
Yeah, and remember these drives that are represented in these regimes. They're drives that we all have because they reflect needs that we have. And so the question is, how do you keep them from getting out of hand? And the ultimate way, by the way, in the classical philosophy, in the laws and in Aristotle's politics, is you mix them up in a certain artful way so that they achieve some stability over time. And none of them is wholly suppressed. And that is, by the way, like the innovation of America in forming a polity is that Madison says in the 63rd Federalist, they have discovered a way to mix up these powers while drawing all of its authority from the great body of the people. So here, it's sort of like they took Plato's laws and Aristotle's politics, and they figured out a way to make a wholly representative government that would protect all of these drives and needs that we have to serve, by the way, because if we, you can throttle the bad needs, can't you? I thought I took away from this. We have needs. There are good needs and bad needs. The government is designed to allow you to pursue your good needs and to suppress your bad needs, and it can be made to work. The bad needs are not need, really. Right. They're wants. You don't actually need to be you don't need to be a drunkard. Yep. Right. And so also there's some, I don't know if we've talked about it yet, but there's some condemnation of poetry. That's in book 10. Book. But you would read poetry to your beloved quicker than you'd read that passage you read. Well, that's book 10, and I think book 10 is the best book. And we'll come back and do an hour or two on book 10 to conclude this. But Professor O'Toole, to wrap up, I want to ask you, just how do your students, are they impacted by this book? I mean, do they actually do more than learn it, understand it, and move on, or does it actually change how they view government and themselves?
Oh, I think it really is quite transformative, at least for some of them. They, in reading The Republic as a whole, I think they get a lot clearer about their own passion and longing for justice. And I think they get a lot clearer about the nature of political life and all of the things in political life that resist reason, and in some ways how that's bad and problematic. There's a lack of sufficient education for your ruling class, and in other ways why that's necessary, why in a way we can't have a fully rational regime.
We're going to pause there for a moment, Professor O'Toole. We can't have a fully rational regime. The framers got pretty close. I'm a great believer that the best regime is the one that they came up with in 1787, as amended by the Civil War amendments, of course, the Bill of Rights. We'll talk more about that. By the way, if you like the founding, there's a great video course at hillsdale.edu. All of our prior dialogues are found at hugh4hillsdale.com, hugh4hillsdale.com. But you want it all. You want all the video courses. You want to sign up for Imprimis. You want to get an application for your son, daughter, grandson, granddaughter. You want to get one for yourself. Go to hillsdale.edu. That's hillsdale.edu. Great sponsor of our program. We love the Hillsdale Dialogues and have for many years. Stay tuned. I'm Hugh Hewitt.
Hillsdale College is a small, Christian, classical liberal arts college that operates independently of government funding, and we want you or your son or daughter to apply. At Hillsdale, students grow in heart and mind by studying timeless truths in a supportive community dedicated to the highest things. Hillsdale College costs significantly less than other nationally ranked private liberal arts colleges and receives regular recognition as a best value, and nearly all students receive financial aid. Our robust core curriculum, vibrant student life, and 8-to-1 student-to-faculty ratio make for an education like no other. For more information or to fill out an application, visit hillsdale.edu/info. That's hillsdale.edu/info.
Welcome back, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt. Dr. Daniel O'Toole is an expert on the Republic. He's a professor at Hillsdale College. Of course, Dr. Larry Arnn is president of Hillsdale College. We're talking about Professor O'Toole's students when they deal with the Republic, Professor.
I'll have to say, in reading book 8 in particular, they love this book because it so nicely shows them the defects and problems with democratic leveling, with oligarchy, with those who are obsessed with the pursuit of wealth. And then Dr. Arnn was what he was saying about tyranny and its character and how it operates and the war that it wages on excellence and on friendship and on one's own citizens. You know, you have a regime that effectively brings in foreigners to beat down its own citizens. It depletes the wealth of its own citizens. It's constantly at war. It disarms its own citizens. The students all recognize immediately this is something that's very relevant to their lives.
Dr. Arnn, when you have taught it, do you have this? I have the same reaction. This chapter 8, and then the discussion of tyranny is applicable in my mind, especially to the tyrants of today. But when you have taught the book, has it changed students' minds about how government ought to work and where it ought to work?
What a book like this does for the young, in my opinion, and it's decisively valuable. It helps them to see things in the round, right? In the end, you have to learn to distinguish heaven and earth. And, what are we? What is God? What is a beast? You have to locate yourself. And young people, they're full of spit and vinegar. And so it's not just, it's decisively, in my opinion, not. It's obvious relationship to things going on now. That's valuable, and it happens. But it's look at those things now in light of everything else. And that's what an educated soul can do.
So I have a very pedestrian question. Very pedestrian question on which to wrap up the book 8 and 9 discussion. Professor O'Toole, when you test your students on the Republic, well, I'm a con law professor. I can test them on cases and holdings. Either they know Dobbs or they don't know Dobbs. Either they know Marbury or they don't know Marbury. And I can be objectively assessing what we call a horse race hypothetical. I've been doing it for 27 years. Pretty second-handed for me. But I don't know how you would possibly test this book. What do you do?
Well, I'm still trying to figure that out. No, you ask pointed questions that first, ask you to demonstrate that they understand the basic movement of the book. They read it, but then to really think through what it means. Partly with an eye to this question: what's the case for and what's the case against every innovation or idea that Socrates puts out there? And what does it reveal about our nature, the nature of politics, about our longings and our longing to know? So you test them by asking questions like that, and it's really quite revealing. And then, of course, you assign essays where they have to do a little bit of exploration and work on their own, where they have to really start to interpret the book and bring their own particular concerns to the book and unpack something specific. And that's often even more revealing.
Very pedestrian question as well. What are you going to do in the age of AI when you assign an essay?
Oh, that's easy.
Trust the honor code.
If you're annoyed with them, if you're annoyed with them or you think they're cheating, ask them to explain the nuptial number.
I'm so glad to know I'm not the only person who's been confounded by the nuptial number, but good Lord. Has anyone ever made an attempt at saying, here we go, this is what this means?
There was a guy 400 years ago, I won't say his last name, but his name was Grant. And he was a very smart guy and a very close political philosophy nerd. And he set out to write a dissertation on the nuptial number. Oh. And like everybody told him, don't do that, and he gave up.
Yeah. Well, I'm so relieved. I thought, man, am I getting stupider as I get older? Because I cannot make heads or tails of this. So I'm glad to hear that. Closing comments on book 8 and 9. Professor O'Toole, democracy gets a bad rap here. We live in a democracy. It's a democratic republic. How ought we to reconcile the fact that ours is the best regime on the planet? It's been the best regime since the Constitution was framed. It's the longest enduring written Constitution. How do we square that? The fact that he's very, very critical of democracy, and yet that is where we are, and we are blessed to be here.
That's an important question. Well, I think part of it is that at least the founding regime wasn't strictly a democracy.
True.
Dr. Arnn was just saying it's a sort of mixed regime, but on a Republican basis. And so it helped stave off and resist a lot of the worst tendencies of democracy. That said, I think it's important for all of us to understand that those tendencies are present, that there's always a kind of resistance to authority, resistance to superiors, a certain tendency in democracy toward leveling that is a perennial temptation and desire, and in our own regime, one in which the progressives acted upon and exacerbated. I also think that our regime has certain oligarchic tendencies, which are also problematic that you see here in Book 8. So I think that those dangerous tendencies are ones that we have to reckon with as perennial problems in political life. Or you could say more generally, the problem of the different factions or the tension between the few and the many.
Boy, that brings up Federalist 10, and we'll get there eventually. Federalist 10 is all about factions. The framers were so aware of the Republic, so aware of Aristotle's politics, and so on top of it. All that is covered at hillsdale.edu in the course on the founding, video course. You'll love it at hillsdale.edu. I suggest you visit it. Welcome back, America. Hugh Hewitt. The Hillsdale Dialogue is underway. All things Hillsdale at hillsdale.edu. I want to conclude with you, Dr. Larry Arnn. Do you think that democracy emerges from this book still the last best hope?
Well, first of all, we're talking about the ancient world, so you have to translate, right? The conditions are different in the modern world. We have religious freedom. We have universal monotheism. So you're going to have limited government, and in a different way than you have in the ancient world. But Professor Jaffa used to say, if Aristotle were alive today and he wrote the Politics again, it would look like the Federalist Papers.
Huh?
And I think that's a fair point.
You know, yeah. You've never told me that before.
It's a great. He came upon the formulation that America is the best regime possible regime and regime in the context of the Christian era. He used to say that. That's that, you know, and see, and remember the radicalism of classical political thought is very apparent in the Republic, but the essential moderation of it is apparent in the Republic and in the whole corpus and in Aristotle very much. That is to say, Plato, I've built this, I had this great teacher. I've built this academy. I've got these students. They're world beaters. That is the highest kind of life. Try to reproduce that for everybody. Instead, what you do is try to protect that for those who can and will. And that's a moderation, right? And that's why this communism is so radically different from Marx, who, by the way, the difference between Marx and Plato is that Marx thinks he's got the whole world figured out in theory and in practice.
Yeah.
And that leads to despotism, right? And he calls explicitly for that as a practical program.
Again and again and again. And when people
he says it's time for philosophers to start acting.
Yeah.
The philosophers used to try to understand the world. Now it's time for them to try to change the world.
That's it. Explicit abandonment of the purposes of this book. On
that note, we are out of time, gentlemen. Professor O'Toole, Professor Arnn, Dr. Arnn, President Arnn, we will be back for Book 10. And I want to tell the audience, cheat code. You got to read Book 10, even if you haven't done the work. Go get Ellen Bloom. It's just such a wonderful chapter on the soul and on judgment and on the good life. I just love it. Love it, love it, love it. And you can get through it. It won't be the nuptial number. There's no nuptial number in Book 10. We'll be back for that later. Dr. Larry Arnn, President of Hillsdale College, and Professor Daniel O'Toole. Thanks to you both, gentlemen.
Okay. Thank you, Hugh.
And we'll get to the nuptial number again sometime, like in 100 years. Never going to do that again. Thank you for listening. Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Harley. Thank you, Dwayne. The Hillsdale Dialogues are all found at HughForHillsdale.com. Talk to you next week on the next Hugh Hewitt Show.
Thanks for listening to the Hillsdale Dialogues, part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. More episodes at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you find your audio. For more information about Hillsdale College, head to hillsdale.edu.